perform a very daunting task, a task which requires a lot of study, a lot of understanding, and quite frankly, a lot of time to discuss. So we'll try our best to do what we can do, and hopefully navigate the, the enormous knowledge of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah, and see how we can benefit from his knowledge, inshallah. So Imam al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah, did not live in a vacuum, as you know. He lived in the 5th century of Islamic Hijri, and in his time, he was also facing a lot of political problems, issues, the fight between the Batiniyya, the Shia, and the fight with the Sunnis and the Abbasis. He was obviously with the Abbasi camp, and as you know, he became a giant scholar. He became very famous in the Nizamiyya Madrasa of Baghdad. He was a celebrity and all of that. He was initially sponsored by Imām al-Muluk, who was the prime minister of the Abbasis in that area. And he wrote some, invaluable books even before he became the Imām al-Ghazālī that we know today. He was a faqih, he was an usuli, he understood all the principles of jurisprudence, he understood Shafi'i fiqh, he was a mutakallim and imam of Ash'ari theology, and he was just a very unique person and almost a polymath. So this is Imam al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah, as we know him. Before the seclusion that he went into later on, and when he came back, he didn't come back to Baghdad, he went home to his hometown, Tus, and then that's where he lived. Eventually, that's where he died. But this theory that we want to present today, Imam Ghazali's theory of Khilāfah, and what we call nowadays a political theory, it came about because he was commissioned actually to write a rebuttal to the Batiniyya, the Shias. And he wrote a book called Fadāih al-Batiniyya, literally translated as the immoral or the scandalous opinions about the Batiniyya, that they hold some theological positions which were totally erroneous, at least from our point of view, the Sunni point of view. And he goes through that book enumerating their ideology, their philosophy, their theology, their practices, the various groups that they had, and goes through a long list of errors that he felt they were making. And amongst those was the issue of imama, leadership and state authority. So he talks about it there, and he talks about it in other books that he has written as counsels for rulers, and other books specifically for rulers and leaders. So you all know he has his book Ihya al-Ulum ad-Din, which is his magnum opus. We all know that. But then he wrote another book just for the ulama, to show the ulama of his time that they're not exempt from this type of reform. And so Ma'yar is that book, and he wrote exclusively for them. And that is how we see Imam Ghazālī wanted to reform the Ummah. But the politics, as we might see it today, is slightly different. It may not be that quote unquote political. Yeah. So sometimes we have problems, especially coming from the West, of trying to, impose our style of reading, our paradigms, our values onto another system and try to see if there's a bridge. And sometimes it's very difficult to, reconcile two very different types of works and two very different types of reading, where nowadays politics and words that are linked with politics, such as human rights and democracy, were not the words that they used, and so on, even though they may sound very similar. And it's like having a hard drive and trying to use a soft drive that's not compatible on that hard drive. So likewise, Islamic literature and Islamic religious literature is not to be measured against the modern day post-Jeffersonian human rights language, and against modern understandings of politics and democracy and so on, because they wrote in a very Islamic language. So when you write in Islamic language, you are going to use some words that are from the Quran and Sunnah, and they have a very different connotation, even though they may sound the same, as I said, in modern discourse, and especially that discourse which is Eurocentric. So when non-Muslims comment about our scholars, and sometimes they make claims that they've understood, and they analyze and think about that, then it is probably more of a process of what we call eisegesis, where you're trying to impose your view on the author's writing. Whereas in our madrasa system, one of the most important methodologies that we use is to understand the murad of the mutakallim. What is the intent of the speaker? What is the intent of the author? So if you want to understand the intent of the author, you have to understand him. You have to understand the context in which he wrote. And more importantly, you have to understand the language he is using. So a modern political language is not the best language by which you can measure any of the early classical Muslim works on the same subject. And I'm not sure it's the same subject. So in Islam, if briefly, not briefly, but generally translated, word for politics, siyasa, and that word itself is subject to debate. What does siyasa actually mean? Politics in the way we understand politics today. So, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned the word kana banu Israel yasu'uhum anbiya'uhum. That's one place where the word siyasa actually comes as a verb. That the Prophet said the Banu Israel, they were governed and they were managed by the prophets. So the prophets now have a role to manage and to govern and enforce Allah's will, enforce the law, enforce Sharia, and so on. So it is here that I think we should begin the discussion of what siyasa Islamiyya is all about. It's much broader than what we might presume here today. So there are different levels of siyasa. One that, again, through Imām al-Ghazālī's works himself, I think we can analyze that there are 4 or 5 levels of siyasa. One is siyasat al-anbiya, that it is the siyasa of the anbiya, the prophets, raising, training, inculcating values in their ummah, and helping them accept the deen and apply the laws of Sharia in their communities as a state law. Okay. So this is, where the anbiya Now they also use tarbiyah, and they also use reform language in their siyasa, where they want to reform the virtue and the value, the mindset and the behavior, the akhlaq, ethics and morals of people, bringing virtue into society, whereas modern day siyasa may be doing that somewhere, but it's not one of the main prime objectives and so on. So for the Imām al-Ghazālī rahimahullah, then based on this, separates knowledge into basically two categories: knowledge that is foundational and knowledge that is now theological, which is based on consequences and results and so on. So knowledge that is intrinsic in the word ilm, knowledge of the Quran, Sunnah, Wahi, knowledge of the ahkam of Sharia, and so on. That you get this discussion in the beginning of Ihya al-Ulum-ud-Din, where he's saying there's beneficial knowledge and detrimental knowledge, and knowledge that is essential and knowledge that is auxiliary knowledge, meaning it serves an ala as a helper, and so on. So he brings in this discussion, and then he says that the knowledge of siyasa, of ruling and governing, is actually not a foundational knowledge. It's there to serve, justice through the hakim, the governor, the ruler, whoever it is, so that we maintain law and order, and we stay away from chaos, and we stay away from violence, and we have, the implementation of law and order, and so on and so forth. So there you can see his mind is basically, on a level that is based on the knowledge of the prophets, because the prophet's role is not just to govern here in this world with justice, it's also to help people procure salvation, which is in the akhirah. So the akhirah-based discussion is very different and broader than the secular discussion of law and order and politics and so on. That's why he separates the siyasa of the anbiya from all other forms of siyasa. So the high level of siyasa is the level of the anbiya, the prophets, who can they not only rule the apparent bodies and the society, but they also rule the inner values of human beings, and they develop their ethics and moral behavior. And more than that, they develop their spirituality and their association and their ta'alluq with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how they worship Allah and how they see Allah, and how they develop a closeness to Allah for all human beings. Now, this is very comprehensive, and that is how I think we should see Imām al-Ghazālī is following the same model in his understanding of siyasa in this dunya also. So you see that the model is much broader. It's a very vast model, and the basic now siyasa of other people he defines as siyasa of the ulama, the true scholars of Islam. They have a siyasa, they have a role in not only defining the moral values of society, but also giving advice to rulers as to how they should govern and how they should lead and how they should rule, and so on. So this is always the case with Muslims. As far as the initial Khilāfah of the Khulafā Rashidun, he would liken them to almost like the siyasa of the Anbiya, a step lower than that, obviously. But since those Khulafa were ulama, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, they were both ulama, they were both scholars, and in their own rights, they were able to govern and lead, not only with the letter of the law, but also with the spirit of the law. So they were attached to ibadah in their own private times, and they were very God-fearing, and they were very pious, as much as they were judicious, and they had insight and foresight, and they had basira and farasa. They were able to rule and govern people as far as establishing the qanun the law, the constitution, if you can use that word, and so on. So they're able to do the mundane part of ruling and governing, and they were also able to do the spiritual part of now ruling and governing, where people looked up to their piety and people looked up to their ethics and moral behavior, and so on. So a combination of both the inner and the outer was present in the four Khilāfah that we know. Then later on there was a split, obviously. So then the people who had now authority, political authority, they were not necessarily always that pious that people would flock to them and follow them. So he makes another category of people, siyasatul wa'adun, the siyasatul salihin, over people and so on. So, you know, there's a story where Imam Zain al-Abidin walks into the haram with a huge entourage of people. Hundreds of people are walking into the haram with him. And then Farazdaq, who is a shair, and he is observing now the entry of the Khalifa, who also happens to be there, President of Makkah. He's also entering. He's entering with his guards and his security detail. And he's looking at this one, Zain al-Abidin, who's from the Ahl Bayt, and he has, you know, a sea of people behind him. So he's asking his guards and everybody else, who is this person? How come he's being followed? Much more than I'm being followed. And then nobody looks to me, they don't even say salam to me. Everybody's now kissing his feet. So Farazdaq composes a magnificent poem. So in which he says that basically, you know, that if you don't know him, then it doesn't matter. That people outside of the haram know him and people inside the haram know him. So this is now a type of siyasa, a type of power to govern and you know, show authority over people. But his authority, Zain al-Abidin's authority over people, was spiritual. It was not legal. That he was not the hakim, he was not the ruler, but people flocked to him because of this spiritual kind of attachment, and people want to be pious and be associated with pious people, and that's where the ulama have always had a much larger impact on society and a much greater impact on society, much deeper impact on society than the rulers on the time. There are exceptions, obviously, like Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and others who were very pious that we know of, but on the whole, so this categorization of siyasa shows that Imam al-Ghazālī is grading the whole idea of siyasa, which could be more of leadership and enforcing authority so that people stay on the right track and so on. Then obviously later on you have the siyasa of the khulafa and the muluk, whoever was the khalifa, whoever was the king or monarch, they had their own siyasa, but that siyasa was limited to now mundane affairs and to mundane law, and so that, you know, there's no violence, there's no injustice, and there's law and order, no chaos, etc. So now, based on this categorization, we see that Imam al-Ghazālī, primarily as he now writes Ihya Ulumuddin, is now dividing the ummah and the community into 2 or 3 groups. So he said the first group, they're concerned about their akhirah. They're concerned about being able to witness Allah's beauty, Allah's face mubarak on the Day of Judgment and in Jannah. They're worried about, you know, eternal happiness and pleasure, not just mundane and secular happiness and so on. So he concedes that there are both levels, but one level is higher than the other, and people who want to be more realistic about life, they should pursue the higher bliss and not simply the lower one. So that is how he writes the Ulumuddin, because in his time, the most kind of ironic nowadays, but the most prestigious profession was to be a theologian and a Muslim lawyer, Muslim judge. They were paid the most, they were, the most celebrated, and that industry really flourished because everyone who had knowledge of Deen and Sharia wanted to be close to the ruler, to the judge, and they had endowments for them, and they had stipends for them, and they were, as you see, commissioned to write books and write commentaries and Islamic knowledge, etc. So then that was the thing to be was to be a Muslim theologian. They would be the closest to administration, they would be closest to the rulers and the courts, and so on. So Imam al-Ghazālī is looking at this because he was one himself. So when he retreats and understands that the inner beauty of Islam is to develop one's ethics, moral behavior, to develop one's attachment to Allah, and one must be able to learn from sources other than what's written in the books. So you should perhaps learn how the other earlier ulama learned and the Sahaba learned without the aid of a book, otherwise known as the oral tradition. So he goes into this now phase of his life where he becomes holistic, comprehensive, inclusive. So he gives merit to the apparent sciences of Sharia, fiqh and tafsir and hadith and kalam. These are all very good, noble disciplines, and you must learn them. But then he says the purpose of learning these disciplines is much higher than that. It's much higher than you seeking a favorable position with the ruler or in the court. Is much more than earning money, is much more than happiness in this world. It is to attain happiness in the other world. And obviously he then had a abridged version of Ihya Ulum ad-Din in his mother tongue Farsi, which he called Kimaya Sa'adat. Sa'adat there means happiness. So it's the alchemy of happiness. So Imam Ghazālī was all about promoting joy and happiness, but not at the expense of salvation and the at the expense of being punished here in this world, in the grave, or on the day of judgment, and so on. So this is his broad theory. Now, ruling, governing in this world is part of it. He says it is fard kifaya. It's a communal duty that you must appoint an imam for taking care of the political lives of Muslims and non-Muslims, and for making sure there's peace, security, making sure that there's no violence, no injustice, etc. So he concedes that it's a necessary component of this life. So he starts off with an idea based on a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ad-dunya mazra'at al-akhirah. That the dunya, this world here, is a farmland for the akhirah. So you farm here and you reap the fruits there, but you can't reap the fruits there until you use this world. So whatever you do in this world is you're farming, you're sowing the seeds, you're taking care of the plants and the crops, and you're doing your agriculture, and then making sure that you harvest when you die, after you die in Jannah. He said, but you can't do that without being here in this. He gives tremendous amount of importance of Muslims being here in this world and not staying aloof like hermits and remain aloof from society. No, he said you have to be here. But the Sharia gives us now the formula to do all this, and that is why you have to maintain the Sharia law in terms of making sure people do not openly sin and do things that are, vile and disgusting, immoral, etc. So the Khalifa or the Imam is there to make sure that happens, along with making sure that you have Sadd al-Thughur, taking care of the frontiers, that no enemy comes in and attacks you and kills you, etc., and making sure that there is an infrastructure of a civil society in this world. So he's all about civility in this world, adab, etc. So he will speak about all of this in Ihya Ulum ad-Din, where he takes us through the various developmental stages in each ethic, a moral value, and each vice. So in his book, obviously, you know, there's a whole book on, or chapter on those actions that are what he calls, you know, munjiyat, those actions that will save us, and then those actions that are muhlikat and mubiqat, that are destructive and detrimental to our health here and also our health in the akhirah. And so on. So he goes with that. So as I was mentioning, he wanted the ulama to be the most refined and the most reformed, because he saw them as a catalyst between the government and people. People always approach the ulama, as I said, and the ulama were always consulted by the rulers. So they played this role of being a liaison for the people and being a liaison for the rulers. So he wanted to reform the whole ummah by reforming the ethics and morals of the ulama, who were now the gateway to, you know, the rulers, gateway to the political system, and so on. And they were also now, you know, the eyes and ears of the people, and so on. So this is his solution. I think Ihya Ulumuddin has many facets and many angles, many purposes, many benefits. But one of the most important is that he wanted to reform the ulama. And then in his time, when he felt that the ulama didn't quite get the message, he wrote a separate book for them, which is Al-Miyar. So that book was written exclusively for the ulama. So the ulama know that when we represent Islam and the Muslim community in front of the rulers, then we have to be just, we have to be pious, we have to be honest, we have to be forthright, and we have to make sure that we are not endorsing injustice, and we're not endorsing any kind of favoritism, and we're not endorsing any other form of violating the rights of other people. So his main focus was, now, as you see from the title itself, Ihya Ulumuddin, reviving the sciences of deen, of religion, by reviving the spirit and the ruh in the ulama. So the ulama class were the most important class to actually reform and you know, develop, so that the whole ummah would be reformed and develop. Slightly different nowadays and so on. But anyway, so more of that a bit later. So he goes through these phases of siyasat, siyasat al-anbiya, and siyasat al-ulama, and siyasat al-wa'adh, and the siyasat of the khulafa and the hukama, and so on. Then in his discussions with rulers and ministers, because they all came to him for advice, okay, so he wrote separate letters to some of these rulers and so on. So in those letters, he really focuses on the same thing, that to develop your relationship with Allah, make sure your salvation is now airtight, and make sure that you have the ability to speak to Allah on the Day of Judgment in a good way, and take care of your inner, and then obviously reform your outer. So when he says reform your outer, what he is saying is that your role is to enforce peace, security, and justice in the you know, the people that you are ruling and governing. So he builds out a system for Muslim rulers and how to behave, how to be, and that's always been the case with all the ulama or of the ummah. As far back as Harun al-Rashid, as you know, the great Abbasi Khalifa, and his right-hand man was none other than Qadi Abu Yusuf, who is the prime student of Abu Hanifa. So Qadi Abu Yusuf was the first Supreme Justice in history, and he was a right-hand man and advisor for Harun al-Rashid, who had a great Khilāfah, had a great empire. So Harun al-Rashid is always advising the Khalifa that you can do this, and he wrote several books for him. Kitab al-Amwal, Kitab al-Kharaj, how to dispense money, how to take care of the state's treasury. And then he also wrote another fascinating small book on how to treat prisoners. And it is in that book that he shows his prowess, he shows his understanding of administration, he shows his understanding of government, and so on. So all I'm saying is that we're not going to go into what he said and wrote, because I'm just using Abu Yusuf as an example, that ulama have always played a foundational and functional role in developing the government, making sure that there are checks and balances in the government, and making sure that if the government, the hakim, the ruler, does anything wrong, they're there to state that, sometimes at the expense of their lives, as I'm sure some of you, if you read Muslim history, you know, this also has happened for two scholars, that they've been persecuted, they've been punished, and they've been, you know, basically executed, and so on. So anyway, so the role of Imam al-Ghazālī is nothing other than the role of all ulama who came before him and all ulama who came after him. In his treatise against the Batiniyah, he brings out some of his ideas and theories of Muslim government, Muslim siyasa, if you want to call it that. And I think we must see what he says there so that we understand his role in developing a coherent, consistent theory for Muslim governance, Muslim government rule, whatever you like to call it. I'm not too fond of calling anything Islamic a democracy, nor am I fond of calling it a theocracy. And Imam al-Ghazālī was the same. We take our lead from him and others who came before him, that we don't want to use and label Islam with these kind of foreign labels. They're kind of alien to us, theocracy and democracy and all of that. And we should take charge of our own civilization and, you know, start representing our original positions with our original words, terminology, nomenclature, so that it is ours, and it's not something that is Eurocentric. I mean, that's for the ulama here, and for the great Muslim thinkers who are maybe here listening, or they listen afterwards. We do need to take an original stance about our civilizational values and the terminology we use, so that it's not just to impress other people that we have similar terminologies. It's for you know, revealing the truth, and the truth is that Imam al-Ghazālī, in a very intriguing way, starts to justify the Sunni position of Khilāfah and Imamah, and that is by you know, initiating a conversation about the first Khalifa. So in the first Khalifa, you see that the method and process by which we elected/selected Abu Bakr to be the Khalifa is kind of strange, to say the least. So Abu Bakr was there in the Banu Sa'idah, and the Ansar were there, some of the Muhajirun were there, and they start discussing leadership and so on. So this Ansar said that there'll be a leader from you and there'll be a leader from the Muhajirun, and so everybody said no to that, and said that doesn't make any sense, that's not leadership. Then after some discussion, Umar was there, and he put his hand over Abu Bakr's hand and said that I'm taking a pledge, I'm taking bay'ah with you, you and I, my Khalifa. And then a few moments later, everybody acquiesced and everybody followed. And they all took a pledge of allegiance for Abu Bakr to be the Khalifa. This is the basic story, simply stated. So we see from this story, Imam al-Ghazālī now looks at this story and says that originally the whole idea of you know, imama and leadership, political authority and political leadership, he's using imama because of his conversations with the Shia, with the Batiniyah. That's why he's using the word there. He said basically, al-imamatu indana tan'aqidu bish-shawka. That the first rule is that imama, political authority, is established through power, through domination, if you want to use that word. I'm not sure that's the best word, but by establishing that you are in power and you have an authority over people, the shoka, which is a good word, I think. And then he further says, وَالشَّوْكَةُ تَقُومُ بِالْمُبَايَعَةِ. The shawka, political authority and power, it stands on bay'ah. It is established by mubayah, that you have a free Muslim person who's willing to take the bay'ah, and you have free Muslims who are willing to offer their bay'ah. So he uses mubayah, the two-way traffic. So the person there must be free, meaning the leader, and the people following must also be free. So ikhtiyar there, and choice and volition is huge for Imām al-Ghazālī. From this, people will decipher and have decided that he's talking about democracy. Nothing. The word didn't exist in their minds at that time, but it is freedom. La ikraha fi din. So there's no compulsion there. So you're free to acquiesce, you're free to agree, and you're also free to disagree until you agree. And that is the case with Ali, radiallahu anhu. He did not take bay'ah immediately, he took bay'ah 6 months later. Okay. But that ikhtiyar there, Islam is given a choice for free individuals to exercise their freedom and volition freely, and not in a compulsive way. That, he says, is the key to the bay'ah of Abu Bakr. Then Umar freely took bay'ah with Abu Bakr, and then the other Sahaba who were there present at that time, they also willingly and freely gave their bay'ah to Abu Bakr, and that is how bay'ah is established, and so on. So we see here now, Imam Ghazālī is trying to understand that process, that this is the origins of the Sunni system, Sunni order. Understanding the origin, it's necessary for us to establish our system of how we elect or select. Then in the second Khalifa, Abu Bakr appointed Umar. And then in the third, then Umar appointed a council of 6, where they decided who will be the Khalifa. And then after Uthman, obviously everything, the war broke out, and that was the end of the discussion. But all these 3 conventions, what they show us is that there is some flexibility and nothing is written in stone. So the whole idea of siyasa now becomes ijtihadi. And the reason it is ijtihadi, because there are no clear-cut nas and scriptural text that we can say defines the political system of selecting, electing, and so on. I think that's very important that Imam Ghazālī, rahimahullah, brings this out in his Fadah of the Batiniyah, and so on. But then another discussion arises from the Ihya itself, that the political power, or the role of the Hakim and the Khalifa is very mundane. I'll stop short of using the word secular because this is another term. Mundane affairs. The Khalifa is there to supervise, take care of, maintain, manage the mundane affairs, the civil affairs of the Ummah. And this also goes back to what the Sahaba said about Abu Bakr. So when the Sahaba, all of them agreed to the Khilāfah of Abu Bakr, they made a statement, and the statement is very intriguing. They said that the Prophet ﷺ entrusted Abu Bakr in matters of their deen when he appointed him to be his Imam. When the Prophet ﷺ was sick, he appointed Abu Bakr to lead the Salat for all the Sahaba. So he appointed him to be his now Khalifa in matters of deen. We have now appointed Abu Bakr to be our Imam in matters of the dunya, the mundane matters. And that's very intriguing. That there, the theory we develop as Sunnis is that the Khalifa there is in charge of all mundane affairs of the state, of the Dawla, of the, the people, that you rule. So you have to establish a police force, you have to establish courts, you have to establish now institutions for education, learning, institutions for collecting zakat, you have to establish the rules and regulations of trade and everything that's needed in order to run a state. You have to establish an army and everything else that a state needs. So in Ihya Ulumuddin, Imām al-Ghazālī mentions this in a different place, which has been mentioned, by the way, by many other scholars before him. So this is not unique to Imām al-Ghazālī, but he mentions this in the categorization of knowledge. So he says that any skill set or profession that's needed in order to maintain and enhance the community is fard kifaya for us to establish as an ummah. Say, for instance, you cannot live in this world today without a doctor, or without a lawyer, or without an engineer, without somebody in agriculture, or whatever the field may be. So the ulama of usul and legal theory, they say it is fard kifaya, meaning that if you do not have a lawyer or an engineer, or a doctor, an accountant in your community, because without them, the community will not function as a community, you are committing a collective sin. So that's how important the mundane affairs of the ummah, they've been seen by the ulama. They did not want Muslims to believe they have to be hermits and they have to go out and live in the wilderness and so on. They said, no, you have to engage as a society, as a community, and acquiring these skill sets is fard kifaya. Therefore, facilitating the acquisition of these skill sets also becomes fard kifaya, where you must now establish these institutions, places of learning, madaris, schools, high schools, colleges, universities, whatever name you want to give them. So Imām al-Ghazālī mentions this in the chapter of knowledge and the classification of knowledge. So he's well in line, synchronized with the rest of the ummah and the previous ulama as to how necessary the mundane affairs of the ummah, because it's a collective duty. It's not just an individual duty. Then, surprisingly, he laments, ironic, because the time has changed now. He laments that we do not find any doctor except from the dhimmis. He said only the dhimmis, non-Muslims, Jews and Christians, they have a few doctors. He says that the ummah, the Muslim ummah, they do not produce any doctors. There's no one there who can treat us when we are sick. We have thousands of theologians and thousands of Muslim scholars and muhaddith and mufassir and all of that, but we don't have an institution of tib. So he's making that point, and this shows us that they really wanted to make sure that their mundane services were provided by Muslims and not by the dhimmi, even though the dhimmis were there and they were employed by the ruler and the hakim and so on. And this shows you that the very cohesive understanding in the mind of Imām al-Ghazālī about leadership, siyasa, and the need to address all the mundane affairs of the ummah. So he makes this statement: Al-imamatu indana tanaqid bil-shawkah wa-shawkata taqum al-mubay'ah, that a bay'ah is necessary in order to kind of justify the imamah and leadership of a human being. What's important to address here is that he, as all the previous ulama that I know of, they all say that there must be one person in charge. They're not in favor of a, a parliament or a Congress. Now, that being said, it's not haram either. I mean, as far as I know. As I said, this is all ijtihadi. It can change with time. And on several instances, it was almost as if Muslims just left politics to be a laissez-faire issue. Let it be what it is, and if it works, it's fine. If it doesn't work, then change it. So, but there's nothing set in stone that you can say this is the definite monolithic theory of politics in Islam, meaning rulership, government, and being able to govern people and establish these institutions and facilities, infrastructure for Muslims. It doesn't matter how you do it, and so you must do it. So we don't tolerate injustice, but we do tolerate the idea if there's one person who has already established his authority and power, then we won't remove him unless there's absolute injustice and violence and so on. So I think that has to be also understood. So in that case, you can have a sense of democracy and you can have a sense of theocracy, where in the concluding statement of Imām al-Ghazālī here, which I have here, it says, وَالْمُبَايَعَةُ لَا تَحْصُلُ إِلَّا بِصَرْفِ اللَّهِ. Is that taqween in the cosmological sense, maybe in a theological sense, that rulership and leadership is something that Allah decides. So he goes off there also. So from this, people may say that Imām al-Ghazālī is supporting theocracy. Nothing like it. They didn't have that idea in their minds. So here we see that this is based on the ayah, قُلِ اللَّهُمَّ مَالِكَ الْمُلْكِ تُؤْتِ الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ. Allah is the one who gives kingdom authority to whomever he wants to. He takes away kingdom authority to whomever he wants to. So he sees this as a divine order that's coming down into the minds of people by people willingly giving their pledge to a person. So that is kind of almost a divine component to the whole idea of who governs and who doesn't, but it has to be institutionalized by human beings. I mean, Allah won't come down with an ayah of the Quran or hadith of the Prophet that you must do this, this, and that. It is just something that is cosmologically provided and ascertained by people at large in terms of, he does appreciate aghlabiyya, that there's a general majority consensus as who is now the ruler and so on, which is also fine. You can accommodate that too. But the whole idea is that Imām al-Ghazālī is saying that the most important is to understand that the effects of leadership must be good. And the effects of leadership, whoever is in power, they cannot be good. So in one of his books that he writes, Tibr is one of the books he writes about politics, if you want to call it politics, more of leadership and governance, is that he likens all of this to a tree. So he says that the root of the tree is Tawheed, and then the trunk is now your ibadat. And then he said the branches, then they come out into justice and tolerance and facilities, conveniences, infrastructure, and all of that. And the fruit, obviously, is the fruit of Iman, which hopefully manifests itself in Jannah and so on. So he said you must cultivate the trunk, and you must cultivate the roots, and you must make sure the roots are firm and firmly rooted, established in the ground. And it's only with this kind of approach and this that you have an ideal for what a Muslim government, Muslim governance is all about. And that unless the government is rooted in Tawheed, rooted in the aqaid of Islam, and unless the Tawheed grows into a very formidable trunk, and until that trunk yields into itself into branches, and the branches don't give fruit, you won't have an idea what Islamic leadership, Islamic politics is all about. So definitely he's not ignoring the idea of Islam and politics. He does write about it in various chapters of Ihya. He does write about it sometimes in separate books that he writes to rulers, etc. and so on. So this is now Imām al-Ghazālī's theory. Since it ties the mundane with the spiritual, it ties this world with the other world, you get a sense that he is a very comprehensive thinker. So he places everything where it belongs. So he doesn't kind of beat around the bush. He's very coherent and very cohesive and very consistent in his understanding of how human beings should be. The bottom line is that Imām al-Ghazālī rahimahullah is ensuring that salvation is procurable with or without a government. He says a society, a Muslim society, cannot function as a Muslim society without Islamic law, Islamic rule. That's a given. Other than that, you can function as a Muslim who wants to procure salvation without a government, like we do when we're living here in the West. He said the ideal is to have a Muslim Khalifa, a Muslim Hakim, Muslim ruler, Muslim governor, who's going to uphold all of Islam, all of Islamic principles that combine, benefits of mundane existence and all the fruits of the spiritual existence that is yet to come in the other world. Inshallah. So this is a khulasa, a summary of his kind of very vast writings. Imām al-Ghazālī wrote on so many different subjects. He wrote extensively Islamic law, Islamic legal theory, extensively on logic, and extensively on aqidah, extensively on refuting the false claims made by deviant Muslims in the Khilāfah also. So he was very much engaged with a dialogue with different types of different groups of people, and he provides us with a roadmap for felicity, a roadmap for happiness in the hereafter. So obviously people before him like Al-Farabi, people after him like Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Khaldun, they've written their theories and their treatises about Muslim government, if you want to call it sociology, which we don't want to call it that. That's there also. But what separates Imām al-Ghazālī is his concern for Muslims in the Akhirah, which is very close to the mindset of prophets and the Khulafā Rashidin. That the mindset of the prophets, when they came to rule and govern, like the Banu Israel, were kind of blessed with prophets who would succeed prophets, and they were also blessed with kings and rulers. So they always had somebody to oversee their mundane affairs, and the prophets would oversee their spiritual affairs along with the mundane. And so Imām al-Ghazālī wants the Ummah to go back into the Khulafā Rashidin model and see what they can do. But he said, no, out of pure necessity, he concedes that, some of the rulers here are not the most pristine in terms of Islamic ideology. They perhaps do not meet certain requirements and standards of Islamic leadership, whether they're eligible or not, whether this one is Qurayshi or not, or that. So he says, in order to avoid a huge calamity, a fitna, he says we have to concede that this is where, if you have ascertained shawqa, power and authority, through a process of bay'ah and pledging allegiance to the ruler, then that will be enough for the moment. That's not necessarily the ideal, but sometimes you have to acquiesce to circumstances, and removing harm from the ummah is a principle in Islam, and making sure there's no more bloodshed in the ummah is following the sunnah of Imam Hassan radiallahu anh. That's what he did when he conceded the Khilāfah to Muawiyah. And the reason he gave is, I don't want any more bloodshed in the ummah. Many Muslims are just dying and being killed just for this reason, political reason. He said, that's not a fight I'm going to fight. So I want to make sure Muslim blood is spared. So the later ulama, Sunni ulama who followed Imam Hassan in this, they did the same. So, okay, that this one may not strictly be following the code of eligibility, but he is established. And if he's established, we're not going to overthrow him until he is, blatantly uttering kufr and, a blatant kind of butcher and so on. So anyway, this is the khulasa, that Imam Ghazālī's mindset is all about being close to Allah, whether you're the hakim or whether you're a street cleaner. What you have in common is tawheed. What you have in common are the aqaid. What you have in common are all the rituals that you need to do, and what you have in common, at least an idea, is that you develop yourselves your good behavior, and so on. So no one in leadership can abuse anyone who is now following and who is a subject and maybe who is a citizen, if you want to use that word, of your particular kingdom or your Khilāfah. And so on. That's the bottom line. And so it's very clear and very objective, and so on. But he brings in usul al-fiqh to show that his level of understanding what is called darura applies also to politics, not just to other issues of fiqh. That at the political level, there is a darura to maintain law and order and to avoid bloodshed and to avoid fitna. So he uses that in order to justify his position for his time, inshallah. We'll stop here. Hopefully, inshallah, there is some time, I guess, for comments, questions. You can write them on the chat. You can ask them if you want through the microphone there, inshallah. So we'll, if the moderator allows, we can have time for that. Is that okay?
Yes, it's completely fine.
Then you may write your questions in the chat if you have any. How have the different political systems developed in Islam been different from since today when one talks in system? People liken it to theocracy instantly. Yeah, I mean, that's, I'm not sure most, everybody does it, but most people do want to assume very romantically that we are theocracy. So that was answered by the statement of the Sahaba that Islamic rule, Islamic state rule, has more to do with the mundane affairs of the Ummah, managing the Ummah, making sure the Ummah is safe and protected, and making sure that infrastructure is there, convenience are there, people are fed and clothed, and people are given homes and shelter, and there's schooling, and there are other, social conveniences provided. That's all mundane. Okay. In fact, Imām al-Ghazālī goes as far as to saying that the siyasa of ulama, when the ulama are in control and they influence society through their knowledge of Deen and Sharia, he says that they don't have access to the hearts of believers. They don't have the siyasa of the Anbiya, where the Anbiya have access to the hearts of believers. They can tell you this act is out of sincerity and this is not. The ulama and the faqih will tell you the mechanics of what is valid legally. And in terms of your mechanics of salat, that if you do this, mechanically your salat is valid. They won't actually tell you whether or not your salat is in a good spiritual condition, because that is reserved for the prophets and so on. And so theocracy is kind of being holier than thou, I think. I don't like the idea. There is a sense that Allah gives the hukum to manage the affairs and to follow the ruler and so on. So that if you say that because we're following a divine order, then the origin of our government is theocratic. That's fine. The idea that the government is going to be now what we call, establishing a divine order on earth, that's, I think, far-fetched. Although, having said that, Imām al-Ghazālī does see the Khalifa as a shadow of Allah's will. But that's a manifestation of Allah's nur and authority coming down to the mundane. So the word shadow means is not the original object of light either. Shadow, obviously, as you know, does not exist. Anyway, but that's a good point. Does ijtihad allow Muslim elite to establish democracy with justification of ijtihad given the existing predicaments? Will it legitimize the authority over Muslims? Will it be sinful if we don't engage in political system of allegiance to the ruler in the case of democracy? If you're talking about Darul Islam, in a Muslim country, you must acquiesce to the leader in terms of policy, especially not in terms of anything that is sinful, as we know from the hadith. Now, as I said, even Imām al-Ghazālī concedes that this is not the ideal structure that I would approve for Muslim rule, Muslim authority, and Muslim leadership. He said there's another ideal, which is one step after this. So we have to go with the status quo. We have to be realistic, pragmatic, and practical. We can't become super idealistic, because then we won't be able to live or function. Then obviously, as I said, the principle of darura will have to be applied here. That will be your ijtihad and so on, if that's what the question is. Are we sinful if we don't engage in the political system? If the political system is based on dhulm, oppression, or some kind of blatant sin, then we do have the prerogative of a nasiha. We have to give good counsel. Now, good counsel doesn't mean violence, and doesn't mean that you destroy the infrastructure. We're not in favor of destroying an infrastructure that is already developed. So you have to be careful there. You can't go around vandalizing and destroying property and all of that. That's not sensible. That's very irresponsible. It takes decades to build infrastructure. And the reason you want a change in politics is because you want to improve the infrastructure, not to destroy it. So if in the midst of reforming, you destroy everything that's been built before, that's not a sensible way to approach violence. There has to be a method by which you persuade people, and so on. Unless you're talking about passive resistance, that's a different issue. Okay, but as far as you live in a Muslim country and you are going to be with the ruler, Sunni political quietism takes precedence here. If you're living in a non-Muslim country, then that's a very different ballgame altogether. You're not required to change the system. You can only engage within the boundaries of the law of the land to demonstrate, to protest, to write. And there are many ways, and there are many people, especially here in the USA, Britain, UK, and England is very different. The way people demonstrate there is very different from the way people would demonstrate here. So the two different systems are there, two different governing law and rules are in place. But if you have freedom of speech, freedom of press, you should use that freedom to voice your opinion and your discontent. And so again, without resorting to violence and so on. Did any Imam follow Imām al-Ghazālī's teaching of siyasa from trust? If so, who? Was there a need to? Yeah, meaning that this was contextual, as I mentioned. So every alim who came, if he was approached by the government, or if he found that there's a need to approach the government, he would contextualize his nasiha based on the problems he saw in that society, in that leadership. It will not be a universal panacea that you can give this one pill to every Muslim ruler who's corrupt. No, it was contextual. So they would use their ijtihad and they would come to terms with what is needed and what is not needed, and they would approach that. But on the whole, they're very sensible people, but on the whole, it doesn't seem to me that they were in favor of violence and bloodshed, inshallah. But yeah, were there people who used this theory? Ibn Taymiyyah developed this theory a bit further, I think, through his writings. So you can read his writings if you want to understand the issue of shawka, issue of political authority and power. So Ibn Taymiyyah uses that, and he develops it a bit more further than Imām al-Ghazālī did. So you can see that. But were there Muslim rulers who followed their ideologies and theories? Maybe, maybe not. But it's all there in the Quran and Sunnah. So I don't think they needed Imām al-Ghazālī or Ibn Taymiyyah to come to terms with what they needed to do. It was all kind of very, intuitive sometimes, and it's also very Islamically common sense. Yeah? maybe not common sense to people who use the Western edifice of politics, but it's very commonsensical to a Muslim thinker. What opinion should we possess about Khilāfah of dynasties, and if there's a difference, conflict with authoritarian Malukiya and Islamic model of Khilāfah? MashaAllah. You're asking for another seminar just on this. So yeah, the bottom line, I believe, in terms of my understanding of Islam and politics and the theories, is that look, you have to ensure that whatever system you are promoting ensures aman, security, and the ability to develop, maintain infrastructure, because that's the fruit of Khilāfah and the fruit of leadership and the fruit of any political system. So you have to be very careful. As I just said, that we cannot afford to be that idealistic. The past is the past. You cannot turn the clock back and say, we were like this. It's too late for that. Okay. Where are we now? What can we do now in order to improve our situation politically, socially, on the ground, economically, in terms of education, professionalism, adab, ethics, moral behavior, Muslim civilization values? What can we do to promote that? Okay, so is it the system or is it the people? And so any system is good as long as human beings don't corrupt it. Okay? So if you have a great system, a great theory, then the theory will be there, but the people who enact the theory, they will be responsible, in charge of making sure that there is no injustice and there is nothing there that violates the rights of people. So it doesn't matter whether democracy or theocracy, whether it's Islamic Khilāfah. The convention itself, as I said, is not written in stone. And you see that from the first three Khulafā. Okay, so whether it's this way or that way. So now you want to blame people because, Muslim, because they become monarchs and so on. But did you know that, the Islamic knowledge was preserved in the first century by the Banu Umayyah? Islamic knowledge in the second century onwards was preserved by the Banu Abbas. Both were monarchs, and they're monarchies, and so on. So if something has been established, then we should say, okay, something good. We must appreciate the good. Evil is there, whether it's going to be this system or that system. So we have to ensure that we're practical, pragmatic, and not become holier than thou, that unless it is done this way, it is not Islamic, and so on. Because there's no, as I said, ijma on the convention. That is very ijtihadi, and so on. It might be that when you rule a certain island, or a certain country, martial law might be the only way you do it. It might be in a certain place, monarchy is the best. It might be in a certain place, tribalism works better than anything else. You have now democracies here. The largest democracy on the planet, obviously, is not a gift from heaven, trust me. Right? So it's not necessarily the system. The system is important, as Imām al-Ghazālī says here, that our system of leadership and selecting leaders has to be along the lines of the Sunnah, which is necessary and important as a theory. But am I going to start a revolution because I don't see the ideal system? No, he never did that. Very pragmatic and very practical. So you have to make sure that you don't promote violence. I think that's my biggest concern with these ideologies and so on. Anyway, could you speak about building quasi-governmental institutional Muslim living in non-Muslim societies? Do you have historical precedents for developing a system of limited self-governance of Muslims living as reverse of dhimmis? Okay. So do we have precedents? The Hanafis have like the Malikis, they both have provisions in their fiqh that if you are living under the rule of non-Muslims, then you must establish some kind of council where you agree as Muslims that you will resort to this council and give them authority over your affairs, and then see if they can rule and govern the way they are allowed to do so in that country. So in the USA, in Canada more so than here, you have now, this issue in marriage and divorce and inheritance laws, mediation and arbitration. So if Muslims want to appoint a committee that is responsible for mediation, or perhaps more, arbitration, then certain states in the USA might allow it. So you can have a European Council for Muslim affairs. Good luck with that. So anyway, so you can. There is enough provision for fiqh, what you call, of the minorities, fiqh al-aqliyat, written in Fatawa Alamgir. The Fatawa that the Mughals had commissioned. What was his name? Aurangzeb, with Mullah Jiwan. They started this huge project of writing fatwa for Muslims living in a minority, ruling as a minority in India. And then in the Hanafi fiqh, as in the Maliki fiqh, you do have this provision that you should have a council. Obviously, that won't happen overnight, and the biggest thing there, the ikhtiyar must be there, as I mentioned right in the beginning. It must be your free choice to say, I will concede to this council. You can't go around saying, I'm the Amir of the Ummah, so you must now be forced to subscribe to this council, and so on. So that won't work. Even if you mandate it, it won't work, because there's just so much freedom, and it's my thing. Don't force me to say or do anything, and so on. But is there room for that? There is room for that if you can agree to it, inshallah. Good. Good. Can you speak about? Good questions. Anything else? Very good. So we'll stop here. Jazakumullah khair for participating. Again, if you have any questions, you may write to me at darulqasim.org. Inshallah, come and see us, come and visit us, and study with us too, and participate in our discussions. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. We thank Al-Balagh for hosting this program. Allah give them barakah and tawfiq and success, inshallah, and give us all Jannah, inshallah, without any hisab. Ameen. Ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala khayri khalq Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin, walhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum.